When the First World War settled into the trenches during the winter of 1914, the German High Command faced a nightmare none of its generals had imagined. The Schlieffen Plan had failed, Paris still stood, and from the Channel to Switzerland, the Western Front froze into a wall of barbed wire, mud, and slaughter. Millions of shells were fired for the gain of a few hundred meters. The old doctrine of massed infantry waves, bayonets glittering, flags snapping, collapsed under machine gun fire. A new form of soldier would have to be created if Germany was ever to break the deadlock. By 1915, one name began appearing repeatedly in the reports reaching General Erich von Falkenhayn at General Headquarters, Captain Willy Rohr. Rohr, an engineer officer from the 13th Brandenburg Regiment, had been experimenting near Verdun with compact assault units trained for speed and initiative rather than mass and discipline. His men learned to crawl through shell holes, to hug the ground, to use every crater as cover. They carried bags of stick grenades instead of rifles and moved in small groups, 10 or 12 men, each with a specific task. The experiments were brutal. The early Sturmabteilung Rohr raided enemy trenches at night, cutting wire under flares, throwing grenades, and withdrawing before counterfire could annihilate them. Their reports showed that, for the first time, the German army could seize a sector without the week-long artillery barrages that warned the enemy. Falkenhayn ordered the formation of Sturmbataillon No. 5 Rohr in 1916, the first official storm battalion in history. At its training ground near Bouville in Lorraine, the new assault troops were moulded into a weapon Germany had never fielded before. Instructors were veterans of Verdun, scarred and deafened, teaching recruits how to cross a parapet, how to throw a grenade underhand so it landed silently, how to finish a wounded defender with a bayonet thrust that did not jam. They practiced in replica trench systems built from photographs of the enemy line. Each squad included riflemen, bombers, flamethrower operators, and light machine gun teams. The key principle was eigeninitiative, personal initiative. Orders were simple, objectives limited, but execution left to the men on the ground. Equipment evolved to match the mission. The model 1916 steel helmet replaced the spiked Pickelhaube. Its thick rim deflected shrapnel, but muffled sound. The Stormtroopers carried Model 24 stick grenades, easier to hurl from trenches than the heavy ball grenades of 1914. Many wore chainmail shoulder pieces or captured British armor plates to survive close-range explosions. Pistols and shortened rifles became preferred weapons, anything that could be handled quickly in a maze of mud and barbed wire. In 1918, they would be the first soldiers in history to use a true submachine gun, the MP-18 Bergmann, firing 9mm rounds from a 32-round drum magazine. A stormtrooper's world was measured in meters, not miles. He advanced crouched under smoke, sometimes blinded by his own gas. The flamethrower teams, 2 men carrying 70 pounds of fuel, were the most feared. When a jet of burning oil roared into a dugout, the battle was decided in seconds. Even fellow Germans shunned those men. They knew the life expectancy of a Flammenwerfer operator was measured in weeks. By late 1916, the stormtrooper idea spread beyond Rohr's battalion. Divisions on the Somme demanded their own assault companies. The 8th Army in the East, under General Oskar von Hutier, studied Rohr's methods carefully. Hutier understood that the key lay not in the weapons, but in the rhythm of attack, surprise, infiltration, dislocation. Instead of a single line, storm units would ripple forward in waves, bypassing strong points, leaving isolated pockets of resistance to be destroyed by following troops. Artillery would no longer flatten the enemy trenches for days. It would creep forward in minutes, a rolling barrage that the assault teams followed so closely they sometimes walked into their own shells. The first large-scale test came on the Eastern Front at Riga in September 1917. The Germans faced the Russian 12th Army across the river Dvina. At dawn, Hutier unleashed the new tactics, a 3-hour hurricane bombardment mixing high explosive, gas and smoke, then the storm battalion slipping across the pontoon bridges behind the barrage. The Russians were stunned. In less than 24 hours the line collapsed. Over 15,000 prisoners were taken. It was the first modern infiltration offensive in history. A corporal from the 14th Bavarian Infantry wrote afterward, "We crossed the Diviner in fog so thick we could see only the man's pack ahead of us. The first trench we found was empty, still warm from the bodies that had fled. We threw grenades into the next and heard nothing but coughing. It was like striking a rotten tree. It fell without sound." That success transformed the reputation of the Stormtroopers. Their black and white skull badges became symbols of elite status. Behind the front, new training centres sprang up at Sedan, Valenciennes and Insterburg, where thousands of men were drilled in the Rohr method. The Allies, still relying on massive preliminary bombardments, dismissed them at first as trench bandits. They soon learned better. By early 1918, Germany's High Command, now led by General Erich Ludendorff, pinned its final hopes on these assault units. The plan was the Kaiserschlacht, the spring offensive, meant to crush the British before American reinforcements could arrive. Ludendorff reorganized his armies into attack divisions centered around stormtrooper battalions. Every aspect of the assault, from artillery patterns to gas types, was refined according to the Rohr model. Training reports from January 1918 describe live-fire exercises where storm units rehearsed the capture of a British trench replica under real shells. One observer noted, "Their calmness under fire was unnatural. They moved like craftsmen, each man aware of his tool and his duty. It was not courage as we once understood it, but a form of discipline born from despair." Psychologically, these men were unlike the ordinary infantry. Many were volunteers, others hand-picked veterans from the Somme and Verdun. They were given better rations, lighter packs, and the promise of early leave. They believed themselves an elite, and the rest of the army believed it too. But their casualties were catastrophic. Entire units wiped out within weeks, then rebuilt with new faces who often survived only a single assault. In the darkness of their dugouts, before each raid, men would sit polishing their weapons, speaking little. The sound of their breathing mixed with the distant moan of shells. Some carved runes or initials into their grenades, others muttered prayers. They knew that once the whistle blew, the next few minutes would decide whether they lived or died. One survivor from the 3rd Guards Division later recalled, "When we went over the top, it was not like a charge. We slipped forward, half bent, the world grey with smoke. There was no shouting, only the ticking of the machine guns and the clatter of our boots on duckboards. I remember seeing an English soldier stand up, arms wide, as if surprised. Then a grenade burst between us, and he was gone. Afterward, I could not remember his face." By the time the war ended in November 1918, the Stormtroopers had become both legend and ruin. They had pushed the Allied lines deeper in a few weeks than in the previous 3 years, but the cost was fatal to Germany's strength. Their success could not compensate for collapsing logistics and starvation at home, yet their methods, small unit autonomy, concentrated shock, coordination of artillery and infantry, would echo across the next generation of warfare. Many veterans of Rohr's battalion would join the Freikorps, fighting communists in the streets of Berlin. A few would one day wear new uniforms under a different banner, teaching a young army called the Wehrmacht how to move fast and strike deep. By 1916, the German High Command understood that the Storm battalions were not just a new weapon, they were a new mentality. But to replicate them, the army needed to break its own traditions. Gone were the parade ground formations and shouted orders. In the stormtrooper camps of Büvel, Insterburg and Sedan, training became a brutal science designed to unteach the habits of the old army and rebuild the soldier from the ground up. At the gates of each training ground stood the same sign: "Hier wird nicht exerziert, hier wird gekämpft, no drilling here we fight." Every course began with live ammunition. Recruits were ordered to move under machine gun fire from the first hour. Officers walked among them, cane in hand, shouting not commands, but challenges. The goal was instinct. If a man hesitated, he failed. If he rose too high over the parapet, he was sent home, if he lived. Captain Rohr's instructors had learned that fear could be reshaped, not erased. They taught men to act before fear could mature into panic. The Stormtrooper's body became his weapon. Daily drills included scaling wire with minimal movement, crawling with full gear through mud trenches filled with water, and carrying wounded comrades under simulated shellfire. In one exercise called the Höllenlauf, the run through hell, recruits sprinted across a mock battlefield while shells from the artillery school exploded overhead. Those who froze were not shouted at, they were simply replaced. Weapons training was just as unconventional. The primary tools were stick grenades, each man carried between 6 and 10, and a pistol or carbine for close fighting. The long Gewehr 98 rifle, ideal for parade grounds but useless in narrow trenches, was often sawn down by the men themselves. The Mauser C96 pistol and the Luger P08 became prized possessions. Their short barrels and rapid fire were lethal within 10 meters. Machine gun sections trained on the new MG08/15, a lighter variant of the standard Maxim gun, cooled by water but portable enough for assault work. It weighed 20 kilos, and gunners were expected to carry it at a run. Perhaps the most dreaded weapon of all was the Flammenwerfer. The flamethrower teams trained apart under tight secrecy. Their weapon fired a stream of burning oil up to 25 meters. Operators were instructed never to pause. Once the tank ran dry, they were to retreat immediately, for a single bullet into the cylinder would incinerate them. Few survived long enough to complete 2 campaigns. One veteran from Sturmbataillon 5 later recalled, "We were ghosts already when we walked. The others moved away from us at meals. The smell of fuel was on our skin, even in sleep." Each storm squad was built like a living organism. At the front were 2 or 3 Granatenmänner, grenadiers who carried sacks of stick grenades for clearing the first trench. Behind them came the Truppführer with a pistol and whistle, directing movement between shell holes, then the Flammenwerfer men, and finally the MG Trupp carrying the machine gun and ammunition boxes. Medics followed at a distance, often armed, because in these raids there was no clear line between attacker and casualty. The doctrine that united them was called Eingreif- und Stoßtaktik, intervention and shock tactics. It taught that the battlefield was fluid, that no single line of attack existed. Each squad was expected to find weak points, bypass resistance, and push deeper while maintaining contact only through flares or runners. Orders emphasized 3 verbs: umgehen, durchdringen, vernichten, outflank, penetrate, annihilate. This new approach horrified older generals. They saw it as chaos, a loss of control, but officers at the front quickly recognized its power. After Verdun, where months of bombardment had yielded nothing but rubble, a silent raid that captured a trench in 5 minutes felt revolutionary. At Bouville in late 1916, Captain Rohr personally oversaw the construction of a mock French position for live fire exercises. Witnesses recorded that his battalion attacked it 20 times in a single day, each time faster, until the entire sequence, from the whistle to the seizure of the final dugout, took under 7 minutes. Observers from the High Command noted that such precision was impossible for ordinary infantry. The assault battalions were not numerous, but they were efficient. One historian later calculated that each stormtrooper killed an average of 4 enemy soldiers for every loss of his own, a terrifying ratio for trench warfare. Discipline was ruthless. In storm units, cowardice was not punished by court-martial, but by replacement. A man who flinched simply disappeared from the roster. Rewards were immediate: extra rations, better quarters, leave passes to Berlin. These privileges created an unspoken divide between assault troops and the rest of the army. Ordinary infantry nicknamed them Die Rohrchen, Rohr's boys, and both envied and resented them. Instructors also paid close attention to psychological endurance. At night, recruits were ordered to sit in absolute silence for hours inside darkened dugouts while explosions shook the ground. The exercise trained them to control breathing, to distinguish shell types by sound. When the door burst open and an officer shouted an order, they were expected to act instantly. Every motion became mechanical: rise, grab, move, throw. The men later described it as being trained not to think. One diary from a trainee in the 187th Assault Detachment reads, "We learned to crawl as if we were part of the earth. You forget the sky, forget your name, only the mud and the sound of your own heart exist. The first time I used the club, I vomited afterward. The second time, I did not. Uniforms evolved alongside their mindset. The M1916 Stahlhelm gave them their distinctive silhouette, its flared rim catching the light of flares like a skull cap. Many painted it with irregular patches of brown, green and ochre to blend with the shell-torn earth, the first real camouflage in modern war. Some carried canvas gas masks slung to their chests, the eyepieces fogged by their own breath. The standard field grey tunic was stripped of shiny buttons, pockets reduced for mobility. A black leather belt carried a pistol holster, grenade loops, and a trench knife. Officers often discarded rank insignia before combat, knowing that a single stripe could draw an enemy sniper's aim. By late 1917, these units had become laboratories of innovation. Experiments were conducted with smoke shells, gas combinations, and lightweight body armor. The Kölner Versuchskommando tested steel chest plates that could stop a pistol round, though most soldiers found them too heavy. Engineers introduced the steel hand grenade 17, the refined stick grenade with a faster fuse and detachable head for bundling into grenade bouquets. When 6 or more were tied together, they could blow apart a machine gun nest or the roof of a concrete bunker. The philosophy of decentralization extended to command. Non-commissioned officers, the Unteroffiziere, became the heart of every operation. They received detailed maps and were briefed personally by officers, sometimes even by division commanders. Once inside enemy lines, communication relied on flares, mirrors, or messenger dogs. The success of a mission often depended entirely on these non-commissioned officers. It was a system of trust, a sharp break from the rigid hierarchy of 19th century Prussian doctrine. In 1917, the Stormtrooper schools began inviting selected officers from other fronts, Bulgarians, Austro-Hungarians, even Ottomans, to study the methods. The Italian campaign at Caporetto, led by General von Below and Colonel Rommel's Württemberg Mountain Battalion, applied them with devastating effect. The Italian Second Army collapsed in days, losing over 200,000 prisoners. News of that victory spread across Europe like a fever. Suddenly every army wanted its own assault battalion. But inside the German ranks, veterans understood the cost. The life expectancy of a stormtrooper at the front rarely exceeded 6 weeks. Their casualty rate at Caporetto alone was over 40%. Replacement battalions constantly drained men from ordinary infantry units, breeding resentment and fatigue in the wider army. Still, morale within the assault troops remained strangely high. They were addicted to movement. To them, the rest of the war, the endless shelling, the waiting, was the true horror. Action was relief. A survivor of the 8th Reserve Storm Company recalled, "We were proud, yes, but we knew we were candles burning at both ends." In the dugout before an attack, you could feel the silence pressing on your chest. Some men prayed, others joked. When the whistle came, everything fell away. You no longer felt fear, only direction. By the winter of 1917 to 18, Germany had nearly 30 specialized storm battalions and over 200 divisional assault detachments. They formed a network of shock troops ready to spearhead the upcoming Kaiserschlacht. Behind them stood the exhausted regular army, the dying empire's last hope for a decision before America's arrival tipped the scales forever. The stormtroopers had become the embodiment of that desperation, young, skilled, expendable. Their officers knew that the new tactics could win ground but not the war. Supplies were vanishing, morale collapsing, and the home front starving. Yet the men trained harder than ever. They wanted to believe they were part of something that still mattered. When dawn came on the 21st of March 1918, the opening day of the spring offensive, they would prove what they had become. Artillery opened fire along a 40-mile front, the largest bombardment in history. Within minutes, stormtroopers emerged from the fog behind the rolling barrage, their silhouettes distorted by smoke and dust. They moved with the precision of the drills learned at Bouville, each man in his place, every second rehearsed. What began as a desperate gamble would become the climax of modern trench warfare. the moment when the Stormtrooper ideal reached both its peak and its doom. By the start of 1917, the German High Command faced a simple truth: the war was bleeding the Empire white. Verdun had consumed nearly 1 million casualties, the Somme even more. Falkenhayn was gone, replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, men who understood that survival now depended on innovation. The Stormtroopers, once a small experiment under Captain Rohr, had become Germany's final weapon of hope. In the east, the new 8th Army under General Oskar von Hutier prepared for a test that would shape the rest of the war: the crossing of the river Dwina and the capture of Riga. It was here that the tactical theories practiced at Bouville would be unleashed on a grand scale. Riga, September 1917. At dawn on the 1st of September, the guns opened. In just 3 hours, the Germans fired more shells than in any previous operation on the Eastern Front. High explosive gas and smoke merged into one continuous roar. Behind the curtain came the Stormtroopers of Sturmbataillon 5, Rohr, and the 4th Guards Division. They crossed pontoon bridges under drifting fog, flamethrowers slung like coffins, grenadiers wading waist-deep in the Dwina. The Russian line disintegrated. Instead of attacking head-on, the Stormtroopers bypassed every strong point, isolating them for the following infantry. Within hours, the defenders were trapped, choking on their own gas shells. In less than 2 days, Riga had fallen. The Germans advanced more than 20 kilometers, a scale of movement unimaginable on the Western Front. A young officer from Rohr's battalion wrote later, "We moved like smoke itself." The Russians were still in their shelters when we came upon them. Some surrendered at once, others fired wildly until the flamethrower settled the matter. When the fog cleared, the city was burning, and we stood on the bridges watching it like men waking from a dream. The Hutier tactics born at Riga became the model for every German offensive to come: brief but violent bombardments, small assault groups striking deep, reliance on speed and confusion rather than mass. It was infiltration warfare perfected, and now Ludendorff planned to use it in the West. Italy's front had been static for 2 years, stretching along the Isonzo River. There, in October, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians launched an operation that would enter military legend. The spearhead was the 14th Army, commanded by General Otto von Below, with German storm battalions integrated among the weary Austrian divisions. Among them fought a 25-year-old officer named Erwin Rommel, leading the Württemberg Mountain Battalion. At 2 a.m. on 24th October, under the cover of storm and mist, the artillery began its Feuerwalzer, the rolling barrage. Gas shells and high explosives alternated in rhythm. Within minutes, Italian positions were paralyzed. Then, through the fog, came the Stormtroopers. They moved along dry riverbeds, scaling cliffs, slipping through gaps the Italians had never expected to be attacked. Entire divisions vanished within hours. Rommel's small unit alone captured more than 1,500 prisoners and seized multiple peaks without losing a man. His report from the day reads like a textbook of infiltration. We attacked in silence, each man knowing his task. The enemy fired blindly into the fog. We moved past their strong points and struck from behind. Once their flanks collapsed, their courage went with it. By afternoon, we had walked 20 kilometers without meeting organized resistance. By the end of the week, 275,000 Italians were captured or missing, 2,500 guns taken. The word Caporetto became synonymous with total collapse. The Allies panicked. Britain and France rushed troops to Italy to prevent a complete disaster. For Germany, it was proof that the Stormtrooper doctrine could break an entire front open. Yet behind the triumph lay a silent warning. The assault battalion suffered losses of up to 40%. Even victory was cannibalizing the elite that made it possible. With Russia collapsing into revolution, Ludendorff saw a narrow window. American troops were arriving in France, but not yet in strength. If Germany could deliver a knockout blow before summer 1918, perhaps the war could end on favorable terms. The plan, Operation Michael, was audacious. strike the British between Arras and Saint-Quentin, split their armies from the French, and force them into retreat toward the Channel. Throughout the winter, storm battalions trained obsessively. Every movement of the coming assault was rehearsed with maps, models, and live fire simulations. Entire regiments practiced advancing behind a Feuerwalzer moving at a walking pace. Artillery officers synchronized watches to the second. Supply troops learned to move food and ammunition through the shattered landscape without clogging the paths of the advancing infantry. The secrecy was absolute. Soldiers were told nothing of the date until the final night. Each man carried 2 days of rations, 220 rounds of ammunition, and up to 10 grenades. They were ordered to travel light, no bedrolls, no heavy packs. They were not expected to return to their starting trenches. At 4:40 a.m. on 21st March 1918, the horizon lit up from La Fère to Arras. 6,600 German guns fired nearly 1 million shells in 5 hours, the most concentrated bombardment in history. Then, from the mist and the drifting poison gas, the Stormtroopers advanced. Observers from the British Fifth Army later described what they saw. They did not come in waves as before. They came in knots, crawling, running, slipping through the wire. The machine gun fire cut them down, but more appeared behind the smoke, as if the earth itself was spitting them out. German assault groups infiltrated through weak points, bypassing British strongholds, cutting telephone lines, and isolating command posts. Entire battalions were surrounded without realizing it. By the evening, the British front was shattered. Over 21,000 prisoners had been taken in a single day. The pace was astonishing. Some units advanced more than 40 kilometers in less than a week, the greatest movement on the Western Front since 1914. Villages fell in hours. At one point, stormtroopers captured General Gough's own headquarters staff before they could flee. But the speed carried its own curse. The deeper the Germans advanced, the more their supply lines stretched. The men had been told to live off captured British stores, yet much of it was destroyed by retreating troops. Storm units halted to loot abandoned trenches for food and rum. Discipline began to dissolve. A corporal from the 23rd Reserve Division wrote in his diary on the 24th of March, "We have broken them, but we are starving." The rations were to follow, but they are lost somewhere behind the guns. We drink from shell holes and eat what we find in the English trenches, biscuits, chocolate, even tea. The prisoners stare at us as if we were animals. Despite the exhaustion, the advance continued. Ludendorff expanded the offensive into multiple phases, Operations Michael, Georgette, Blucher York and Gneisenau, each designed to keep the Allies off balance. In every attack, the stormtroopers led the way. At Villers-Bretonneux, Kemmel Ridge and the Lies, their tactics achieved local miracles. British machine gun nests were outflanked, French batteries overrun, entire regiments routed. Yet the German army itself was unraveling. Behind the elite spearheads came divisions of boys and exhausted veterans unable to hold the captured ground. By June, the advance had slowed to a crawl. A captured British officer from the 12th Division later told his interrogators, "They were not soldiers as we understood it. They were predators. We heard them before we saw them, their grenades, their short bursts, their guttural shouting. It was not war, it was murder in the mist." The stormtroopers' ferocity stunned the Allies, but their strength was finite. By July, the German assault divisions were shadows of their former selves, starving, sleepless, their officers dead or wounded. Many had marched over 60 miles on foot, through endless shellfire and rain. The spring offensive had gained ground, but lost the war of endurance. By the late summer of 1918, Allied counterattacks, now supported by tanks and fresh American divisions, began to roll back the exhausted Germans. The same infiltration tactics once used by the stormtroopers were now being studied and adapted by the Allies themselves. The balance of innovation had shifted. Inside the German ranks, despair took root. Veterans of the Storm Battalion spoke openly of futility. One recalled years later, "We had learned to win battles, but not wars. Every trench we took was another grave to fill." Captain Willy Rohr, the man who had begun it all, was transferred to a staff position in 1918, his body wrecked by wounds and exhaustion. He watched as his creation disintegrated, its best men dead, its doctrine devoured by the chaos it unleashed. When the armistice came that November, only fragments of the original assault battalions remained. Yet the legacy of those men outlived the empire they fought for. Many of the veterans found themselves unemployed, embittered, and drawn to the paramilitary Freikorps that erupted across post-war Germany. They brought with them the same ethos of aggression and initiative that had defined the Stormtrooper spirit. In the political street battles of 1919 to 1923, their trench-honed violence reappeared under new flags. And on a technical level, the ideas they forged, the small unit autonomy, the coordinated use of artillery, armor, and infantry, would resurface in the 1930s under a new term, blitzkrieg. In this sense, the Stormtroopers were not just the final soldiers of the old world, they were the first soldiers of the modern one. When the guns finally fell silent on the 11th of November 1918, the survivors walked home through a land that no longer existed. Their units were dissolved, their medals meaningless. Some returned to families who barely recognized them. Others wandered from town to town, unable to adapt to peace. They had lived for movement, shock, and the adrenaline of survival. Now there was only stillness. A former stormtrooper of the 1st Guard Regiment later said to a journalist in 1922, "We learn to live without fear, but that is not a gift, it is a wound. Once you have seen men burn in front of you and felt nothing, you are no longer a man. You are a weapon that has lost its war.